So I'm going to talk more about what it's like to be a woman working in humanitarian work and some of the things that have cropped up, particularly around security. I am also an engineer, though I have to say a very humble one in comparison to all the qualifications that Sarah has. But it was very interesting, having started as an engineer when I studied in Portsmouth. There were 6 women out of a year of 101 men. So have always been used to being a minority. But as a feminist, at the time, it was always very much about being gender blind, that I could do anything that the men could do, and was very much about sort of trying to achieve that. And it was only after working in this country for a few years, I joined VSO and went to Namibia. And that was my first opportunity to work with a gender specialist, a fabulous Finnish lady who taught me to be gender aware rather than gender blind. And it's something that's stuck with me for the last 20 years or so, that I don't wish to admit to. And it became particularly apparent to me in one of my first posts, which was in Afghanistan in sort of 2002, 2003. A very conservative society, but as a woman there were definite advantages that the men didn't have that opportunity. And particularly in Afghanistan, as head of an engineering team, we'd go into a community to do an assessment. And as soon as you'd arrive, the village elders would surround you and talk to you, and it would be very difficult, as Sarah was saying, to get that broader perspective. So we came up with a strategy that whenever I went to a community, I always took one of my male engineers with me. So we'd get out of the vehicle in the village. The white man was obviously the most important person in the group, so he would be taken off and fed vast quantities of tea and would sit under a tree and have a very interesting chat, which left the rest of us to actually be able to do the walk around the village and talk to the community members. And the way we got around the translation issue was we had a very young translator. He was about 20. So he was seen as a child, so it was much easier for the women to be able to talk to us. So if you're gender aware, you can see how you can use these things to your advantage, and they don't, although there are disadvantages, there are advantages. And this really also transfers over when we start thinking about security for aid workers and that importance of being gender aware. It can be very simple things. If you're working in a country where you're travelling through a lot of checkpoints, who do you put in the front seat of the car? Do you put a man or a woman? Now, in a lot of societies, there's still that ingrained respect or politeness towards women. So you put a woman in the front seat because the army officials and things are more likely to be polite and talk to you than they are if you have a man in the front seat. In other contexts, you certainly wouldn't put a woman in the front seat because they would find that quite rude. So it can make very simple things, can make a very big difference to how you're perceived and your security and your ability to function in some of these contexts. One of the projects that EISF, who I work for, is currently looking at is around the difference around diverse profiles. And quite rightly in this country, we have anti-discrimination rules about who you can hire and questions that you're not allowed to ask. But this has had an impact sometimes at field level where it's driving us again to be gender blind rather than gender aware. And if you look at some of the security plans that you see in offices, is they don't bring out those things because of this assumption that everybody can do everything and everybody is the same. It's not picking up things like you should have a woman in the front seat of the car, or it's better if you're traveling to this area that it's a man who is the spokesman rather than the woman. So there's a lot of things that we can do that don't necessarily have a very obvious big impact, but they can make little changes that help us. And EISF, I forgot to bring an example, I'm not as well prepared as you. EISF did a paper a couple of years ago around gender and security and really sort of unpacking that issue around the importance of being gender aware. One of the questions that often crops up around sort of security and women is should there be separate security training for women? And I have to say this is a question that I still don't know the answer to, and there's pros and cons on both sides. One of the disadvantages is it reinforces this perception that women are the weaker sex, that they need more protection if they go into the field. We have to look after the poor little dears. Unfortunately, most security officers at field level are still men. A lot of them are ex-military, and you can see a difference in attitude to how they treat women. And if women have to go on special training, it can reinforce that perception. One of the other problems is and the UN used to run a very good women's security training program, but it was entirely by women for women, which is really interesting and great. But how are the men going to learn if we don't give them an opportunity to hear what our issues are? And I think a couple of examples that I certainly came across in the field, one, again, in conservative environments, both men and women, but particularly women, have to think about how they dress. And you go around permanently in long sleeves, baggy clothes, long trousers. When you go home to your own compound where you're living, I want to wear, to my culture, my vest top, my shorts, do a bit of sunbathing. But if you're in a compound where there is no good divide between where the guards and the drivers have their space and where you are, it means you're permanently on show and you don't have that ability to wear what is comfortable to you. Now you may ask, why is that a security issue? One, it can affect the perception of the women, and there's a lot of debate about, how you dress, what impact does that have. But it also means that you're never relaxed. You're always on duty. And stress levels have a huge impact on our decision making and our security. But how many men would actually think about why it's important to have that barrier between where the national staff are and where the international staff? And often you're just seen as elitist. Why won't you invite these people to the barbecue? Why won't you let them come and use our garden? And it's not because you're being elitist, it's just because you need that little bit of your own space and your own time. So we have to make sure that men are involved in these discussions and understand what our concerns are and why. Some of the advantages of having specific training for women is around providing this safe space for women to talk. And it's interesting, when I was younger, I definitely don't need any specific training for women. As I've got older, I've far more appreciated how important it is to be able to talk to other women. Particularly, I mentioned around sexual violence and things like that, those issues for female staff is a problem, and you need to provide a safe space for people to be able to talk about that. But sexual assault against men is also there. Do they feel comfortable about talking about it in a mixed setting? Maybe we need separate training for men and women, and around that gender awareness. If we talk about safe spaces, it's particularly important for national staff. How do our female national staff have an opportunity to share what are the concerns that are facing them? Last year I was in one of the refugee camps in Jordan, and I was talking to the young Jordanian staff, female staff, and asking them about assault and harassment. And were they happy to report it to their male boss? And the young woman I was talking to, very modern, very outspoken, and she was going, yeah, absolutely. And then she stopped to think and she said, yeah, but I'm not sure my colleagues would be so willing to do that, particularly in a culture where, as a woman, if you're harassed, it's seen as your fault. And what they developed there was this small committee or group, not sure you'd even call it a committee, that shared ideas amongst themselves and discussed things amongst themselves. So if there was an issue around harassment, that one person could speak to the male boss. So they were aware about the issue, they could do something about it without it stigmatizing a particular woman. And it's really, it's so culturally specific and so context specific. There is no one solution that fits everybody. But when we're looking at our national staff in particular and our female national staff, we need to find a way that enables them to be able to share what their concerns are. And also for them to know what they can report. A particular sad example for me was in Nairobi. And there was a young woman who came to one of the trainings, and we were talking about this. And she gave us her example, which she hadn't reported because she didn't know that she ought to have done. She'd got a job with an INGO in Nairobi, and it was in a part of Nairobi she didn't know. And she got the bus there each morning, and she'd been working there for about 2 years. After a couple of months of her starting this job, every time she got off the bus, this man was waiting for her and would walk with her towards the office where she was working. He was very polite. He didn't threaten her physically. The language he used wasn't threatening. So she didn't realise that this was actually a security. This was an assault. She was being stalked, basically. And she'd got to the point that she was actually about to quit her job because she was so upset that this was happening. And it hadn't occurred to her that she could talk to the INGO about this problem. She just thought it was something she had to put up with as a woman. So that on a slightly sad note, so I'll try and raise it up a bit. A couple of weeks ago, it was International Women's Day, and we asked for quotes from all the women that we knew working in security risk management amongst the NGOs. So I'd just like to finish with a couple of quotes. Many of our national staff are women, focused on delivery of our programme objectives in often difficult and insecure contexts. Such staff put into daily practice our security management frameworks, approaches and methodologies, and we need to constantly bear them in mind. And the other quote, the participation of women in security is not measured in numbers, but in the quality of our contributions.